let's kind of dive into things a little bit. I brought you on today to speak specifically about powerlifting programming. Um, I I follow you on Instagram, and you always have a lot of great content around kind of philosophy and principles around powerlifting. So that's kind of what I want to dive into a little bit today. Some of the questions that I'll be asking are kind of be centered around some of your more recent posts. But before we get into that, I just want to kind of tell the audience a little bit more about you, and feel free to jump in if I mess up, because this is all just based on things I found online. I feel like they probably should be fairly accurate, but if they're not, just let me know. So you have your coaching, I guess your own kind of coaching business, and then you have like a powerlifting team called Hull Strength Systems. Is that correct? And then you're a gym owner of Arctic Strength, and that's a kind of a more powerlifting based facility out of Lethbridge, Alberta. You're currently a 74 kilogram powerlifter, and these are some of your best lifts. You have a 507 squat, a 275 bench, a 584 deadlift. And what I really noticed about you that really was impressive to me was kind of looked up, and with each kind of lift, you're making steady progress. And in many cases, I look at a lot of other lifters, especially a lot of elite level lifters, and they kind of hit a plateau and they kind of stay at those numbers for a long time. So it's just awesome to see that you're constantly improving and bettering yourself in terms of progression wise. So is there anything else you want to add to kind of that, or?
Yeah, no, I think that was good. Those are my competition numbers. I haven't been on the platform in like a year, so I've squatted, benched, and deadlifted more in the gym. But I compete in March coming up here, so that's my chance to kind of improve those numbers by even more and put some of those put some of those numbers to shame. Because like the squat is pretty dated. Like the 507, I've squatted 575 in the gym now, so I'm hoping for 600.
Nice. Awesome. Yeah. To be honest, I should have looked at the date of your when was your last meet?
It was February of this year, so it's been almost a year since I've been on the platform, and that was very planned. Me and my coach talked after that meet, like, hey, you need to like get some more muscle on your body. You're kind of skinny. So we took some time off. I ate my way up from 167, 168-ish pounds to about 188 pounds. And then the last couple months I've been on the cut back down, and I'm sitting around 172 now, trying to work my way back down to that 168-ish mark to cut into the 74 kilo weight class for Westerns in March.
Nice. Let's talk about a little bit about that in terms of what you kind of did to how your training changed from more of maybe a powerlifting focused program to more of like a program where you're not only working on strength, but you're also adding in some more muscle building, hypertrophy based training.
Yeah. A lot of that revolved around the extra calories I had for growing muscle. We kind of wanted to really utilize that extra energy putting in my body to really put a lot of emphasis and like focus on accessories. So usually when I peak for meet, so when I was coming out of that meet in February, I was only training 4 days a week, and I was doing very little accessory work. Coming out of that meet and increasing my calories, we increased my workouts to 6 days a week. And we had, for a lot of that period of time, 2 full days just focused around accessories, mostly upper body accessories. So that was like a big part of it. It's just like way more accessory volume. We would still keep in some heavy work. Like the barbell work never really got too far away from being more than like sets of 5 at most. We occasionally hit some like secondary days where we'd be around kind of the 8 rep range for maybe like high bar squats for like the primary movements, but a lot of it was focused around like solid kind of like lots and lots of accessory volume through like hack squats and belt squats and lots of dumbbell bench and lots of machine chest press and lots of arm and shoulder and trap and just everything kind of stuff rotating for about 6 months there. And just really trying to like emphasize training that stuff really hard. And it's not that I wasn't training my kind of like main compounds, my squat, bench, and deadlift really hard as well, but they kind of, I don't want to say took a back seat, but because I was training the accessories more hard or harder, I was more tired going into those compound movements. So I was always training those with a higher level of fatigue because they weren't the main focus. So those would be kind of the two big things. It's just like tons and tons of accessory volume that I wouldn't usually do as a power lifter. And I say tons, probably to most bodybuilders, they're like, bro, that's not even that much. Like you did like 2 sets of arms, like calm down. But for a power lifter, it was a lot of accessory volume kind of training, quote unquote, like a bodybuilder. And then just like lots of calories in my body to fuel it. So go ahead.
Well, you were training 6 days a week, so that's like a big step up from the 4 days a week, right? And then I think everyone's volume needs are going to be different based on what they're trying to bring up. So let's say you already have very well developed biceps and triceps. You're probably you're not going to allocate as much volume to those exercises, right?
Yeah, and that's what it was. Like we had a decent amount of like volume, but you do so much squatting and deadlifting as a power lifter that like just you're gonna have big legs if you have a decent squat and a decent deadlift. But my upper body really suffered, and I think that was a big part of like when you look at my bench, it's not super impressive, at least compared to my other 2 lifts. But I dealt with a lot of injuries kind of back in, I guess it would have been like 2018 through kind of 2020 through my shoulders. We've done a decent job of managing those, but it still kind of comes down to whenever I'm pushing my bench super, super hard, I would tend to re-injure my shoulders and like deal with some pain around that. So the kind of thought and theory is like if we pack a lot of muscle onto your upper body, hopefully you're a little more durable and you can push your bench training a little harder and make some progress there without just re-injuring it. And knock on wood, so far it seems to be working, but we'll see. I got a couple more pounds to get off, so we'll see how my body feels a little bit lighter.
Do you think just from adding in more variability to your training with more accessory-based exercises, you potentially decrease your risk of injury just through an increase in different movement patterns, the way that you're stressing the tissues?
Absolutely. I think on kind of the more broad sense, I think I've maybe mentioned this in a post or 2 before. I think a lot of younger powerlifters hyper specify too early in their powerlifting career where they're doing very high frequency squat, bench, and deadlift, but especially bench. And they're not having a lot of variability through like incline bench and dumbbell work and just like flies and stuff like that. And I think that is where people do get very like fragile and kind of at risk of injury. So I think that variability has been very helpful for me, especially kind of incline work. The injury that I sustained was kind of like a upper pec injury. I say shoulder, but it's kind of shoulder related, but it's basically I was doing a board press. The person was holding the board wrong. I tried to rotate the bar so I wouldn't crush their thumbs. Oh, we have a cat. Say hi. So I rotated with like 225 pounds and I just felt like tearing through my upper pec. And it seems like every time I work up really high on bench, that seems to like re-pull and re-aggravate. So I think just adding a lot of like incline work allowing me to kind of like target that area of my chest and build some more muscle on there has been super helpful. But I think that's exactly it. It's like the variability of movement making me very durable in different ways has been a big part of it. And I think that's something that young lifters hyper specify too early and can really benefit from having more variability in movement.
Yeah. I even see that with kind of more intermediate to advanced people just assume because they're becoming stronger that they need to do more specificity in terms of their lifts because they're trying to replicate maybe one of their favorite lifters on Instagram. And I've kind of, as a coach, I've fallen into that trap as well, whereas I've added in more SBD for my lifters and it just ends up beating them up too much and they can't recover. So what I find for just like my average genetically gifted individuals, keeping in a lower frequency and kind of hammering those accessories out in the off season tends to be a better benefit for their longevity over the long term.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Sorry for the cat. They were supposed to be
It's okay.
locked in
It's
the other
okay.
room, but they broke in. We have some adopted kittens here hanging out. So yeah, no, I would agree
Cats.
100%. And there's a huge time and place for that specificity, especially going into a powerlifting meet. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think the further away you are from a meet, the more kind of generalized you can be. And I think that was a big part of like us wanting to take time off after that last meet is that time off allowed us to be more generalized in my training and hit more variability of movement to really build muscle and add that durability and hopefully lead to some good progress. Again, we'll see what the results are come March, but it's looking pretty good.
Well, well, yeah. Based on what you're saying, you've kind of already smoked your prior meets lifts. So obviously, what you guys did had some productive outcome in terms of building your strength. And I think a lot of people think if they're not hammering their comp lifts all the time, they won't make progress. But just based on kind of a lot of people I've worked with and yourself and many others, like you can still get stronger while not necessarily being hyper specific with the big three.
I should add that I was 188 pounds when I squatted that, so as
You'll be
I'd like
20
to
pounds.
say,
You'll be 20.
I was gonna say, yeah,
You'll be
if I got to do it again, but 20 pounds lighter, and I had a big old belly to kind of bounce my quads against for that squat. So we'll see
yeah.
how it turns out when I'm all lean and small and stuff.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm going to ask you also in terms of the accessory movements. Um, in my experience, like a lot of people, bodybuilders included, but in this case, let's talk about powerlifters. When they do their accessory lifts, they think that the only way that they can progress is by adding load. Um, in your experience, in your kind of specific instance, was that your main focus of these lifts? Was adding weight to see progression, or are you incorporating other variables to see progressions?
I think a little bit of both. I think load was definitely like a factor in it. Like I was seeking to hit load PRs in different variation movements. Like I hit all time PRs for like incline bench and dumbbell incline bench and dumbbell bench and just several different movements. Not one rep maxes, but like rep PRs, like new all time 6 rep PRs and 8 rep PRs and 10 rep PRs and stuff like that. So load was
Mm-hmm.
definitely like a big factor we were progressing, but there was a lot of other things too, like adding tempos and adding pauses, and there's a huge focus on contraction and
Nice.
like rep kind of progression as well, like hitting, for example, doing like AMRAPs and like okay, the most I've ever done 100-pound dumbbells for on dumbbell bench press is 12 reps. So I'm going to shoot for 13 reps this time, kind of thing. So there, AMRAPs and kind of rep progression was probably the second most common one, and then the third most common one for me was variation. Progression of
Mm-hmm.
like adding in those pauses or those tempos or different stuff like that. But anything we did for accessory work, there's always like a huge focus on contraction and stretch. So making sure that I was bringing the movement through a very full range of motion, whatever it be, trying to get it through the fullest range of motion, and then at the other end of the movement, trying to make sure that I am getting a good contraction in whatever muscle group I'm trying to build.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great point that you bring up, and I want to just talk to you a little bit about how bodybuilding and building muscle is different than maybe how you perform a power lift. So in terms of powerlifting, our goal is to move the weight in the most efficient way possible from point A to point B, whereas bodybuilding, we're trying to get the most kind of mechanical tension through that muscle, and that might mean that we're not in the best position mechanically. So with your hypertrophy work, Were you then, if let's say we're talking about the contraction and the mind muscle connection, if you were not able to sustain that for some of your movements, would you then maybe pull the weight down just so you can maintain that kind of full range of motion, that mind muscle connection, those sorts of things?
I would, yeah. Um, I think it's a huge practice skill, and I feel like I'm pretty good at doing it no matter what the load is. But I think it comes down to like my coach and how I would define it for my athletes is technical breakdown versus and technical failure versus like absolute failure. So pushing a movement like all the way to failure, but all of a sudden the last couple reps start getting a little higher and a little higher and a little higher. It's like, no, if you're going to go to failure, and this is how Gavin has kind of explained it to me, is like, if you're going to go to failure, every rep better look exactly the same. As soon as those reps start looking not the same, that's your point to stop, kind of thing. So that's how I always viewed it, and I think the longer I viewed it that way and the more I've done it that way, the closer those things have gotten where I'm able to reach absolute failure while maintaining my form all the way through. But I think there's also like a huge mental aspect of like forcing yourself not to cheat. Like, yeah, maybe if I cut my reps a little bit short or didn't pause them or whatever, maybe I get 2 or 3 more reps. But if not doing those reps, I'm still reaching failure, but I'm holding myself to that like higher standard. So I treat basically all of my accessory movements like a bodybuilder in that way because I want to build that muscle. The more muscle on my frame, the potential I have for strength as a powerlifter. So when I
Mhm.
am doing those accessory movements, I'm very much treating it like a bodybuilder, very much like holding that really high standard so that I'm reaching technical failure, not cheating my technical failure to get a few more reps to absolute failure.
Awesome. Good stuff, man. I want to kind of transition now into just talking about how you would, let's say you have someone new who's never lifted before, but they want to get into powerlifting. What are some of the things that you're going to have them start doing from the get go to kind of best set them up to be well rounded powerlifters and have a career of longevity in the sport?
Yeah. Um, it's interesting because I think back in the day, new lifters wouldn't just jump into powerlifting. Like I feel like it was like most people coming to the gym for the first time was doing some type of bodybuilding. Um, and now we see like newer lifters, like young lifters, they start lifting and from day one they want to be a power lifter, which very blessed to kind of be in an era where that exists as a powerlifting coach and as a powerlifting gym owner. It's been like wild to see just being in the industry and being lifting so long and how that was like never a thing.
Most people didn't even know what powerlifting was until like 4 or 5 years into their lifting career.
Yeah. Well, and I think that kind of like stems to part of the issues. I think a lot of powerlifters are picking up programs that are hyper specialized um, to the squat, bench, and deadlift. So I don't think that is the worst thing ever, but I do think that it means that you'll probably have to spend more time being generalized later down the road. So my piece of advice would be if you can find a program that allows you to be more generalized. Obviously, you want a program that does have the squat, bench, and deadlift. So you are practicing the technique and learning how to do the movement. My preference for newer lifters, it's kind of funny because it stems to be like the opposite of what I recommend for, I guess, almost like more intermediate advanced lifters, where I tend to say like you want to keep some lower rep training in to keep that skill practice. But with newer trainers or with newer lifters getting into powerlifting, I think there's huge merit to doing the squat, bench, and deadlift 4 sets of 10 or more with lower loads. Like a lot of people, like their first week squatting is probably going to be with an empty bar. Like you probably
This
should
was what? Sorry.
probably should be with an empty bar. I mean, there's exceptions to that.
Yes.
But you know, like if you're trying to learn the form and the technique and like make sure you're squatting low enough and hitting depth and stuff like that, it's gonna be really hard to do that like skill progression wise if you're also really worried about the load. So starting with a really light load, probably something you could honestly do for like 20 reps, and you're doing it. I mean, that person has no context of what that weight might be, but just know that it should be very light. And then doing some
Hmm.
like sets of 10 where you're getting a lot of repetitions to practice. Like I know it's a big thing for people to kind of like want to jump people into like 5x5 or like 3x5 or like something that has a little more load to it. And I think there's some merit to that for people that are have been lifting for a while, maybe in more of a bodybuilding sense, and they are transitioning over into powerlifting. But specifically with like a person that's day one in the gym and they want to start powerlifting, I think even though it sounds like bodybuilding, doing those higher repetitions and getting more skill practice and then progressing that basically until you can't progress it anymore, then dropping the reps a little bit, progressing that until you can't progress it anymore, then dropping the reps a little bit more, continuing that for about 6 to 9 months until you know you've kind of ran out of places to drop other than to one rep, and then continuing to progress one rep until you find a one rep max is probably a pretty good idea. That linear progression we call it in I guess sports science terms. Um, but basically just continuing to add load every week, but just starting very light and high rep, progressing until you can't progress that kind of like 10 to 12 rep range anymore, dropping the reps to like maybe 7, 8, progressing that for a while, dropping the reps to 5, progressing that for a while, dropping the reps to 3, progressing that for a while. And then finally you reach a point where you drop the reps to 1, you progress that for a while, you find a 1 rep max, and then you have your 1 rep maxes, and then you can start following a little more of a structured program. Um, and in that time when you're kind of running through that progress, I would do a lot of like generalized kind of quote unquote bodybuilding work, lots of accessories to build a lot of muscle. I think that's one of the most powerful things you can do as like a beginner level lifter is build as much muscle as you can and really take advantage of those newbie gains.
Yeah. You see a lot of lifters that are like they're they're plateauing, and I think for a lot of them it's like, and they're being very hyper specific with the big three, but they're making very small progress from year to year. But it's like, man, like I think you just kind of hit your genetic potential based on the current amount of muscle you have. Like muscle is what's going to move weight, right? Obviously there is a technical component, but you'll reach a point where there's diminishing returns on how much work you're putting in to get stronger from a technical aspect.
I would agree 100%. I think that was kind of a big issue of mine a little bit earlier in my powerlifting career is I put all of my energy and effort into my main movements, and then when it came to accessories, I would just sandbag them, and I refused to let myself gain weight, and I really kind of capped myself. And then um, more recently, I've learned I need more muscle in my body, hence the taking a year off of competition, gaining a lot of weight, trying to gain a lot of muscle in my body to kind of fuel that progress. So, but it's hard. It's hard work, and that's probably why a lot of people stray away from it. Is it takes a lot of dedication and effort. So
Yeah, definitely the patience needs to be there, but I feel like people, they might stay in that spot for a while, but eventually they'll get sick and tired of not progressing. So the only option will be to take kind of that long road if they want to get better, right? And it's
yeah,
the thing is, like for yourself, you've gained 20 pounds over the course of 6-ish months, and like you're not going to stay there forever. You're coming back down, so you're going to be. Some people like to be smaller because they have better body composition and all those things, but like it's not a long term thing. It's like build and then come back down, and maybe you'll do that again if it wasn't enough. So,
yeah, that's
and I,
that's kind of the plan is to continue doing that until I have enough muscle in my body to be competitive. So, well, the
yeah.
goal is world champion one day. So I might have a few more cycles left in me to get there.
Well, the reality is just even for bodybuilding, like people do bulks and cuts for a lot of people with just kind of middle of the road genetics, it might take them a decade to build enough muscle to be like competitive on a competitive on a mic drop.
Sorry about that.
So it's all good, man. It might take them a decade just to become competitive on a national level. So it's like it's just kind of part of the game, and I think I've seen this on some of your posts before on Instagram. Is like the powerlifting and bodybuilding. They're very similar. They're different, but they have a lot of kind of interconnectedness, if that's a word. But
we'll pretend.
I also like to. We'll pretend.
I think it is.
Interconnectedness. Well, it is now. You also made a post about how, like, a lot of people, they assume once they're getting into powerlifting, they have to immediately find out what their 1RM is, like what they can max bench. But you made a post on how, like, how about you spend a couple weeks like just practicing, maybe doing the higher reps, and then slowly, gradually kind of bringing those reps down so that like you can perform the lifts with proficiency. The risk of injury will be lower, and the actual number you'll get will be a better representation of your actual strength levels. And that's kind of what it sounded like you were talking about with the beginner powerlifter as well, kind of following a similar approach. I probably, they don't need to wait 9 months or a year to kind of test out the 1RM, but still taking 2 to 3 months to kind of build up to that, I think is going to be more positive than benefit, more positive than negatives.
Well, I think that's exactly it. Is like people want to jump into the gym on day one and go 1 rep max test. And usually that's how you see people get hurt, or you see those kind of like very cringe internet videos. Like, what is this person doing? It's like you built up like no awareness of how to move your body before you loaded that weight. And I can see it from the way that you're moving that weight. If you've not built up the technical proficiency to actually be able to express your strength, and it's often guys trying to lift 405 or whatever, young kids, and it's like, hey, that's kind of an impressive weight for how you're doing it, and like you are much stronger than that if you were actually to learn the technical proficiency to learn how to move your body and be more like proficient at lifting that weight. If you were to do that, then you could lift a lot more than 405 because you're lifting 405 with, frankly, awful technique.
Mm-hmm. It's a vicious cycle though, because like they go to a kid maybe in high school, they go to a commercial gym. When you look around at the strength levels of most people at the commercial gym, like a 405 deadlift is like quite impressive. So they hit that 405 with that horrible technique, and then they get all these I guess positive confirmations from their friends, like, man, you're so strong, like you're so impressive. And then they just feel like they have to continually hit that 405. They never improve their strength. Eventually they end up in Snap City. Their powerlifting careers are done.
Yeah. It's a vicious cycle.
It's a very, very vicious cycle. There's a lot of things we can talk about. I want to ask you a little bit about, you made a post about changing your technique, and you made one point about managing your center of mass better. Do you want to kind of go into that a little bit? Because I think not many people would understand what that means.
Yeah. So your center of mass or center of gravity or whatever you want to call it is like a fancy way of saying that the bar is staying over your midline. So wherever the weight needs to be for you not to lose balance and essentially have to be in a place where your body wants to fall over and it has to overcorrect for that. So I'll use the squat because it's kind of the most easiest. I guess it's very similar for deadlift, but basically you want the bar to stay over your midfoot. When the bar is over your midfoot, it's able to move in a straight line up and down. If the bar always wants to return to that point. So if the bar strays in front of your midfoot, something in your body has to pull it back to the midline. If it falls behind the midfoot, behind that center of mass, it has to be pulled back into it. And that causes kind of like inefficiencies of movement because something in your body is compensating to bring that bar back to that center point. And because it's, you know, like the easiest way to describe it is like, what's easier, moving a free weight where the bar can go, back and forth, or doing a leg press where the bar is on a track and it can only move on that track. As soon as that weight is on that track, it becomes easier to move. So in a way, even though the bar has the ability to go forward and back, we almost want to try to put it on an imaginary track as if it was a leg press or a hack squat. Obviously, easier said than done, but what we can do as lifters is we can refine our technique and our setup to get that bar centered over that midline and lift it in a way where the bar wants to stay more or less in that same midline to create kind of like an imaginary track for it so that we eliminate some of those inefficiencies that can lead to failure. I did an Ed Cohn seminar years back, and something he said really stuck out to me was most missed lifts don't happen on strength, they happen on loss of positioning / loss of technique. When somebody gets out of the positioning where they're strongest is where they fail. They have the strength to lift more weight, but they're not maintaining their technique in a way during the heavy loads that allows them to express that strength. So when I talk about keeping the bar over of your center of mass, that's what I'm speaking to, is creating a way of lifting for you. And that can look very different between, me lifting or you lifting, just because our body proportions are different. But the goal is the same, to keep that bar over that midline, that center of mass, to manage that center of mass so that we can keep pushing the weight up in a straight line and we don't have to waste energy because it strayed from the midline to bring it back to the midline that leads to us failing at weights that we, in theory, would be strong enough to lift.
No, that was one of the best explanations I've heard about that. So thanks
Oh,
for sharing that with us.
thank you.
And then that's you'll see, like when you're watching people lift, you'll see them raising on their heels, or you'll see them kind of lifting off their heels, or you'll see the positional changes to the torso as they're performing the back squat. Is that all kind of compensations to manage that center of mass?
Exactly. So, for example, like if the heels start lifting up, that probably means the bar is really far in front of you because it's pulling those heels up and then it has to pull back, right? Or if you see the toes lifting up, the weight is probably shifting too far back, coming back down. So if the bar stays over that midfoot, it is pushing the entire foot into the floor, and you're not going to see stuff like that. Now, there's other ways of compensating it that aren't the foot as well. Like sometimes you'll see people's hips shoot into weird positions because their center of mass isn't properly loaded, and stuff like that. But there's some type of compensation occurring to bring that bar from outside of the midline back into the midline that is going to lead to a loss of power.
Would you say that at like the higher echelons of strength production or force production, when someone's really kind of near that top of the 1RM, will there inherently be some of those kind of deviations just from the amount of load that they're using?
I think you're more punished from like higher levels of deviation. Like when I think you look at like really high level lifters, please don't knock down my mic again. Bye, kitty. um, when you see really high level lifters, I think inherently you see them do this really, really well. Because the higher the load becomes, the more you are punished for the bar leaving that center of mass, that center of gravity. So I do think it's one of those like higher level things that separates like elite level lifters from, I guess, not elite level lifters. I mean, like if you're squatting 600 pounds and you don't understand how to like manage your center of mass, you are really, really brute strong. And like if you learn how to like manage that center of mass, you might be squatting like 600. I think some people that kind of, and maybe this is me overgeneralizing because this is kind of where I was stuck when I was really poor at this, is a lot of people kind of get stuck in that intermediate range because they continue getting stronger, but more strength should be there. They're not able to express their strength at the highest level because let's say I'm able to do like basically what I could do for a 1 rep max for 2 or 3 reps. But as soon as I load anything heavier, I fail it and I can't do like a singular repetition there because that bar leaves that center of gravity. I think the higher, like the closer the rep is to your true 1 rep max, the more punished you are for allowing that weight to leave that center of mass because, like trying to do a good morning with 600 pounds is just really, really hard. Like you got to be really, really strong if you're pulling that bar back from your center of mass in like a good morning and you're not able to kind of manage that weight and kind of stay underneath it. And I have seen some like really good lifters like get to that level. This cat. I've seen some like really high level lifters like get to that level and have like a pretty decent level of success not being able to do that. But I've seen those same lifters learn about that and then all of a sudden have a lift like blow up. Like one lifter comes to mind, I won't name names, but he had like a phenomenal deadlift, like an elite level deadlift, but his squat was kind of lacking because he would kind of lose his positioning on his squat a lot. And then he got around some people that were a lot better at squatting and they kind of taught him how to manage his center of mass better. And then the strength we were seeing from his deadlift started transitioning from his squat, and his squat blew up to be closer to his deadlift really, really fast because he had all of that strength from deadlifting and he was managing it really well while he was deadlifting, but he wasn't when he was squatting. So there was this big discrepancy between his squat and his deadlift, and then his squat caught up to his deadlift. And that's a very similar experience I kind of went through as well with my squat. Is like I had this like really big deadlift back in the day, and was really good at managing my center of mass for my deadlift. But my squat, I was really, really poor at. I was a very inefficient squatter. And when I started working with my new coach, Gavin, a couple of years back, and he started teaching me about managing center of mass, and those things started clicking, and I started kind of falling into a better position. My squat blew up, and now my squat and deadlift are like neck and neck.
I feel like that's very common actually to have that discrepancy between lifts. Do you mind if we go into like maybe some potential strategies for someone who's struggling with the squat to improve their ability to manage that center of mass? Because when I think about it, it's like number one, let's start at the feet, make sure that the weight is balanced on the feet. But can you talk on some other important pieces?
Yeah, so I think putting weight into your midfoot is a big one. I think the unrack is really important for this. This is kind of a stance I've taken as of more recently, is kind of like if your setup is crap, can I swear on this podcast?
Absolutely.
Okay. If your setup is crap, then by the time you start lifting, you're fucked. Like 90% of it comes down to your setup. When you are unracking that bar, wedging yourself in, being patient, getting your back really, really tight, getting that bar into a place where it feels comfortable, getting your feet perfectly underneath it where the bar is in line with your midfoot, and then driving up. And you'll be able to tell really quick on the unrack if you're doing this correctly, because if your feet are too far behind the bar and you push up into the bar is going to push forward into the if your feet are too far in front of the bar, when you start pushing up, the bar is going to pull you backwards. So when you have your feet perfectly aligned under the bar and you drive straight up and the bar goes straight up and it doesn't go forwards or backwards, so you have it in line with your midfoot. Now, you let it settle for a second, you take your 3 steps back, and when you're taking those 3 steps back, you are focused on keeping that bar perfectly aligned over your midfoot. You get stacked into your setup. you let the bar settle, and then you squat. And you just try to maintain that position the best you can all the way through. But you start creating that position before the bar is unracked. Like, you don't unrack the bar and then try to find that position with 400 pounds on your back, right? It's so much harder, right? Like, you do it before
Yeah.
the weight is even on your back. So it all kind of comes to your approach to unracking the bar. And the same thing could be said for bench press. Is like, your arch is only going to be as good as the tightness you create before unracking the bar. So those steps usually come prior to lifting the weight. They don't come like after you already have the weight in your hands or on your back. And deadlift is kind of easy in that regard because the weight starts on the floor and you grab it and then you pull yourself into position and then you pick it up. So I think that's why a lot of people excel at deadlift, is because it's the easiest to manage your center of mass. More or less, the bar kind of rolls into place to be in your center of mass, whether you like it or not. So it's the easiest to kind of create that really good position, but it's really hard to do that with squats and bench press, and takes a lot of effort into creating a very good setup to make that happen.
In terms of the deadlift, like a lot of people say this is their second rep always feels better than their first rep. Is that what you find as well with your athletes? Like it might be easier than the squats and the bench press, but there's people still do have issues as well. Cause sometimes I'll see that bar kind of translate forward and then they have to kind of pull it back in.
Yeah. I think, that is probably one of the issues we do see in deadlift. Which, like I said, I think it's less punishing than a bad setup on squats or bench press. But I do still think that improper setup can be punishing. Either not getting as tight as you need to be, not being in the same position. I think kind of once you lift up the deadlift for that first rep, for better or for worse, it pulls you into the right position. And then as soon as you put that rep down, you're in that like proper position and ready to do your second rep. But I do think that can kind of be minimized and ultimately eliminated by having a really good setup, lining the bar up with your midfoot before picking it up, getting your body into the proper position, going through the steps to kind of like pull yourself into that tight position. I think a lot of it comes down to practice too. Like, I know I haven't had too many athletes struggle with this, but I do know a lot of coaches will program reset reps as kind of a programming tool to help people with this, because they essentially never get a second rep. If they're doing a set of 3, they put the bar down, they walk back to the bar, they reset up, and it forces them to practice the setup every single rep to perfect it. And I think, practice makes perfect. So the more people are practicing that setup, the better off they're going to be. So that's a very popular programming tool for people that struggle with that. But I do think that is kind of the same issue we were talking about with the squat, bench, and while it might be less common, I think that's the same thing. Is like, setup really makes or breaks the lift, even with deadlift.
Well, that's definitely some great points there. With the, you made a post about the bench press, which I found was like very, very important. That's not really discussed often. Was about unracking in competition. So, like, let's say that someone's training, they have their coach there, or they have a friend there that's always unracking for them, and then they go into competition and they just ask for an unrack from some random spotter that they've never worked with before. And if that unrack is off, that can dictate essentially whether or not they're going to make the lift or not. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, this kind of plays into one of my neurotic habits, I guess. I've had many discussions with people that disagree with this online, and I get it. And I think the argument against kind of what I was saying is that, just ask a variety of different people in the gym to unrack for you and get a bunch of crappy unracks and be ready to handle it, so you're ready for that competition. I get it. But personally, and for my athletes, I like to leave nothing to chance. I like to control as many of the variables as I can possibly control. And I think if you have the ability to set up in a way that allows you to unrack the bar yourself and not need a handoff from somebody, I think that puts the most power and the most control in your hands to not, like, let's say you're in a very tight battle and it comes down to every kilo to win, and your third bench, you get a really crappy handoff where the person just like yanks it out of your hands and you can't get back into a good position, and then you miss that lift, and maybe you would have got it anyways, but maybe in this hypothetical you would have got it had you gotten a better handoff, or maybe you would have lost 2.5 kilos if you'd unracked it yourself, but you still would have got 2.5 kilos more, and maybe that's what you needed for the win, right? The less variables you can take out of your hand, like the more variables you can keep in your own control and take out of other people's control, the better. It's the same thing with like judging. Like maybe squatting a little bit lower reduces how much weight you can squat, but it eliminates any doubt from the judges. So that's probably a good decision to make because you're removing that from other people's hands. You're taking more autonomy into your own meet performance. And I think taking a handoff takes some autonomy naturally out of your hands. Now there's certain lifters where they can't get it off the rack. The way they set up, the way they feel strongest benching, they cannot get the bar off the rack without taking a handoff, and that's something you're offered in competition. So for those athletes, I instruct them that they need to be well versed in describing exactly what they need in a handoff, because you get an entire minute to complete that lift. You should take that entire minute and use it to the best of your ability. So when you walk up to your handoff person, giving them clear instructions of what you want allows you to gain some of that autonomy back. Like, obviously, you can't control whether they actually do it, but if they have no idea what you want and what's going to allow you to succeed, the chances of them messing up the lift is much higher. So simply just by giving them some simple instructions of like, hey, I want a really light handoff, help me guide it out and then just get out of there. I just need a little bit of help off the top and then you can clear out. Or I'll give you a count to 3 and then I need some help, or hey, I need a little more help getting whatever you need personally to help you succeed. You should be ready to articulate that to whoever the head spotter and loader is in competition to do that. Now, that's obviously like a IPF CPU problem. If you get into other federations, they allow you to just bring your own handoff person, in which case just bring your own coach. But it's a very unique problem that lifters kind of within my circle, my sphere, have to deal with being in the IPF, the CPU. So I think it's a good skill to either learn how to do it yourself or learn how to articulate what you want from that person.
Mm-hmm. No, that's some really great advice. And I wonder if you were to like have, I guess, because some people they're not very good at describing what they want. So in training, if they just ask a random person, like kind of practice their descriptions, and then if it works, awesome. Like, and if it doesn't, like maybe try changing the way that you're wording it or whatnot, or communicating it with the handoff person.
And that's what I tell them too. For the ones that believe me that that's actually a thing they need to do, great. Sometimes they have to experience it for themselves. They're like, "Oh man, I wish I listened to you." I'm like, "Well, it happens."
Well, that's how you learn, right? Is through experience, and that's not always positive experiences. So
yeah,
there's so much more we could talk about today, but I think we covered a lot of great information for the listeners and for myself. So I want to thank you for coming on and speaking with me today. You're one of the kind of the earlier guests on the podcast, so it's great.
Thank you for thinking.
We're willing to kind of. No worries, man. I'll probably have you on again in the future. So like I said, there's a lot more we could talk about. But before we wrap things up, can you share with the audience kind of where they can get in contact with you for coaching, or if they have any questions, those sorts of things?
Yeah. Feel free to just shoot me a DM on Instagram. That's probably where I'm the most active. My Instagram is Max Hall Fitness. Yeah, if you're ever in the Lethbridge area, swing by Arctic and come say hi. Let me know you're coming. Shoot me a DM. And yeah, if anybody's looking for coaching, feel free to hit me up. And if you just have any questions about powerlifting or powerlifting training, also, again, just feel free to hit me up. And I'm always happy to have chats with people.
Awesome. Great stuff. Well, thanks again, Max. And I hope you have a great rest of your Sunday.
Yes, you as well. Thank you. I'm gonna go wrangle some kittens now.